Hello, historians. Welcome back. Today, we are discussing a concept called the long civil rights movement. Now, you may be familiar with this concept, or it may be completely new to you, but likely either way, you know something about the civil rights movement. Today, we're going to discuss kind of how to understand the civil rights movement within a framework that might be a little bit different from how you've been taught up until this point when it comes to the history of the Black freedom struggle. So I encourage you to take notes, follow along, pause as you like to, or if you need to. And if you are completing an assignment or taking a quiz as part of a companion to this lecture, you are encouraged to do that while you're participating in the lecture. So you can watch it and do the quiz or the assignment at the same time. So as always, I am your hostess, Dr. Summer Cherland, and let's get started. All right. The long civil rights movement. Now, as I mentioned to you previously, this may be a familiar concept to you, or it may not. Or it may be, the content may be familiar, but the framework may be a little bit unique. So today we are talking about civil rights, Black power, and the Black freedom struggle. All right, I'm going to give you three scenarios about the history of segregation. Segregation is the separation of people based on race. Which of these three scenarios of segregation and challenges to segregation do you recognize? Are you ready? Scenario A. An African-American rider challenges racial segregation on a streetcar. At the time, the state in question had a separate car act, meaning Black people were not allowed to sit in the whites-only section of the streetcar. The Black rider, supported by a committee of citizens, challenged this law by sitting in the whites-only section. This person was asked to move by other riders and later told to leave the streetcar altogether. The rider refused. This rider was arrested. This rider challenged the arrest and the Separate Car Act in state court, citing the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. The state found the rider in violation and state law, as well as state law, and arrested the rider. The rider then appealed the decision, and through a series of appeals, the case made its way to the United States Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court read the laws, the appeals, the testimonies, and determined that yes, segregation was legal and not in violation of the Constitution, but with one stipulation. All separation of races must be predicated on equality. Therefore, separate but equal was established as the baseline for all legal segregation in America. Scenario A. Scenario B, maybe you recognize this scenario instead. An African-American rider challenges racial segregation on a city bus. It was 1955, a year after the Brown v. Board of Education had determined by the United States Supreme Court that segregation was unconstitutional and therefore illegal. Despite this, at the time, all buses in this state in question were segregated. When a white rider got on a crowded bus and asked a Black rider to give up their seat, the African-American rider refused. The rider cited Brown v. Board of Education as their rationale for not vacating their seat. As a result, the Black rider endured abuse from the bus driver and was eventually arrested. For several months following, similar incidents in the same city and on the same bus continued to occur, as Blacks resisted segregation and ultimately launched the Montgomery bus boycott. A year after the first incident, the Black rider, that first person that I told you about, who was arrested, joined with 3 Black women to file suit against the city for violating Brown v. Board of Education. The case made it all the way to the United States Supreme Court on appeal, who determined that segregation was not legal in public services and accommodations. Scenario C. You've got 3 scenarios. Here's your last one. An African-American rider challenges racial segregation on a city bus. At the time, the entire country enforced segregation. Blacks had to ride in the Black section of buses, trains, and streetcars. One day, a little old Black lady got onto the bus. She had worked a very hard day. She was very, very tired. She sat down in the front row of the bus and was minding her business. A white rider got on the bus and insisted that she move to the Black section. She refused. A yelling match ensued involving the man, the little old lady, and the driver of the bus. Ultimately, the white rider sat down in the black section of the bus, officially breaking the color barrier on public transit forever. After that, the civil rights movement started and segregation stopped across the country. All right, which of these scenarios is familiar and which one of them is Rosa Parks? Because as you listen, you probably recognized possibly the story of Rosa Parks. Was it scenario A? A black rider challenges segregation on streetcars, and the case goes to the US Supreme Court, who determines that separate but equal segregation does not violate the Constitution. Was it scenario B? A year after Brown v. Board, a black rider on a city bus challenged segregation through action and legal measures. Or was it C? A little old black lady launches the civil rights movement when she refuses to sit in the blacks only section of a city bus. A white rider finally gives up his fight and sits in the blacks only section. You probably think or recognize one of these stories, and you probably kind of weirdly connect to one of them and think that this is the story of Rosa Parks. Do you want to know what the answer is? Take your best guess, write it down in your notes so that you can, hold yourself accountable to what you think it is. Which of these scenarios do you think is Rosa Parks? The answer is it's none of them. Did you know that? It's none of them. Some of you might be like, yeah, I knew that, Dr. C. A lot of you might not. A lot of you have been told a story about Rosa Parks that has probably become ingrained in your memory or your understanding of the American Civil Rights Movement. Let me explain. Scenario A. A black rider challenging segregation on a streetcar. The case goes to the United States Supreme Court, who then determines that separate but equal or segregation is constitutional. That happened in 1898 with a person named Homer Plessy. So this is Plessy v. Ferguson, 1898. This is 70 years before the 60s, so this passage of the Civil Rights Act. This is close to 60 years before Brown v. Board. So this is actually the establishment of segregation as a legal measure, not the reversal. Okay, maybe you thought it was scenario B. A year after Brown v. Board, a black rider on a city bus challenged segregation through action and legal measures. This is the closest to Rosa Parks we have, but there's more to the story here, and here's what we're going to talk about today. This story is about Claudette Colvin. Now, how many of you have heard of Claudette Colvin? Some of you may have, many of you may have not. How about scenario C? This is probably the one that you thought was Rosa Parks, this little old lady who gets on a bus and she sort of defies and she's so tired that she won't get up. A little old black lady launches the civil rights movement when she refuses to sit in the blacks only section of a city bus. A white rider finally gives up and segregation is sort of over as a result of this. Okay, this is a myth. It did not happen that way. And here's what I want to teach you about today is how did this really happen, right? How did this story unfold? But more importantly, why is the story of Rosa Parks mythologized and told to you as if it's a version of reality? You should be curious. I hope you are. But most likely, you're probably a little lost, and that's okay if you are. I'm going to include a series of clips in this lecture. So there's some embedded video in this lecture. So it may be a little funky. The links to the YouTube clips are directly provided in the Google Slides. So if you're watching this along with me, you might need to have two screens going, or you might need to pause the lecture and go to a direct YouTube clip, but I am going to include it in my recording. So if you're lost, let's clarify a little bit. Let's start with who was Homer Plessy.
I'm Williams, I'm a historian, and here's what you need to know in order to sound smart about Plessy versus Ferguson. The Plessy versus Ferguson case originated with Louisiana's infamous Separate Car Act of 1890. The Separate Car Act required African Americans and whites to sit in segregated compartments on public carriers in Louisiana. People at the time of the Plessy decision actually believed that it was possible to measure the amount of black blood who had in their body. The plaintiff in the Plessy case, Homer Adolph Plessy, was actually described as 7/8 white. Homer Plessy was arrested after he refused to give up his seat in defiance of the Separate Car Act of 1890. Plessy versus Ferguson is considered an important case because it established the doctrine of separate but equal that allowed states for the first time to legally segregate the races. One of the reasons that Homer Plessy brought suit was because of the difficulty in enforcing segregation in states like Louisiana. Louisiana had a large mixed race population, making it very difficult to determine where the line could be drawn in terms of separating the races. The doctrine of separate but equal that grew out of Plessy versus Ferguson became the standard for all segregation ordinances after that decision. Despite the Supreme Court's ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, the first municipality or city to pass a residential segregation ordinance was Baltimore, Maryland in 1910. The Supreme Court's landmark ruling in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 ultimately was the death knell for the doctrine of separate but equal established in Plessy versus Ferguson.
All right, so
Large numbers.
I want to introduce you to Homer Plessy and his story because he is among the first, but not the very first, to use public transportation as a measure of confronting and challenging segregation and racism. But what happens is when Homer Plessy and his colleagues take this case to court, the ultimate end is the opposite of what they want. Because he was 7/8 white, he was trying to both pass and also demonstrate that there was no constitutionality around segregating the races, especially if a person has like a mixed heritage. And so he's trying to challenge segregation. What happens is he actually affirms it through the civil rights, or through the Supreme Court rather. Well, then who was Claudette Colvin? I mentioned this person, Claudette Colvin, who might be interesting to you. This is a person who's 60 years after Homer Plessy, also using public transportation to try and confront racism and segregation.
That day, when the bus driver asked me to get up, I had this feeling come over me and felt like Harriet Tubman was holding me down, hands were holding me down on one shoulder, and Sojourner Truth hands were holding me down on another shoulder. And I was glued to the seat, and I could hear the white pensioners saying, "She gotta move, she gotta move, that's all, she gotta move." And I felt like this is my time to take a stand for justice. My name is Claudette Colvin, and in 1955, I refused to give up my seat to a white passenger on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, 9 months before Rosa Parks. I was 15 years old. And the rule and the segregation that a white person had to sit in front of you and you sit behind them. And so the bus driver asked me to get up. I was shouting, "It's not constitutional right, so I'm not gonna move." And that's when the policeman dragged me off the bus. Most people ask me, "Were you afraid?" When I was a teenager, I was afraid, but I was more angry at these white pensioners. And then they took me and booked me. I still vividly can hear the sound of the key go. And I was terrified. And I started reciting the Lord's Prayer. "Thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven." And I was just praying for help, praying that they would go and let my parents know that I was in jail. My mom would say, "Yeah, Claudette, I think you was anointed by God to do this." I said, "I don't think so, Mom. I just felt that this was not right. I just wanted people to come together and unify and fight this segregation."
So Claudette Colvin, a 15-year-old girl who did the same thing Rosa Parks did, but 9 months earlier. And guess what? On the same bus and with the same bus driver that Rosa Parks encountered 9 months later. Whoa. Is any part of you like, wait a second, Why do I hear about Rosa Parks, but not Claudette Colvin when I learn about the civil rights movement in my 5th grade, 6th grade, junior high, high school history classes? Give me more information about Claudette Colvin, but also the story of Rosa Parks. So let's talk about Rosa Parks, this sort of cultural icon, and what we know about her.
Most of us know the inspiring story of Rosa Parks, the African-American civil rights activist who refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. The bus boycott spurred by Parks's arrest would help bring down the racist laws of the Jim Crow South and turn a young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. into the country's best-known civil rights leader. But we bet you didn't know that the story behind the bus boycott isn't quite as simple as it might seem. To start with, Rosa Parks wasn't the first Black woman to resist bus segregation in Montgomery. In fact, several different women had been arrested for the same offense in the last 12 months. One of them was 15-year-old Claudette Colvin. On March 2nd, 1955, she was riding the bus home from high school when the driver demanded she give up her seat for a white woman. After Colvin refused, police officers arrived on the scene and dragged her off the bus in handcuffs. Claudette Colvin would go on to become one of 4 Black female plaintiffs in Browder versus Gale, the Supreme Court case that would effectively end bus segregation. As a longtime volunteer in the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP and secretary to its president, Rosa Parks advised and supported Colvin. She knew that local Black leaders had been thinking about how to confront bus segregation in Montgomery for years before 1955. She also knew they were looking for a test case, an upstanding citizen they could rally the community around. But Parks certainly didn't plan on becoming that test case herself until December 1st, 1955. At the wheel of the Cleveland Avenue bus that day was James Blake, the very same driver who had ordered Parks off his bus after a confrontation 12 years earlier. Parks was sitting in the middle section of the bus when Blake told her and 3 other Black riders to stand up so that one white man could sit. The 3 other Black riders moved, but she refused. Some people have said Parks was simply too exhausted from working a long day to move to the back of the bus, but she said later she wasn't physically tired, just tired of giving in to Jim Crow. The real story behind the Montgomery bus boycott may not be as simple as the myth, but it is no less powerful. The courageous resistance of Rosa Parks, Claudette Colvin, and other ordinary women became the life force of the civil rights movement.
So a couple key takeaways when we talk about Rosa Parks herself, not the myth, but the reality, is that A, she wasn't very old. She wasn't a little old lady. She was a young woman. She was probably late or early middle-aged, right? She was a professional woman. The other thing is she wasn't just like some sad granny who was sitting on the bus and somebody was arguing with her. Rosa Parks was a local activist. She'd been involved in the NAACP for decades. And as you saw, she was the secretary of her chapter of the NAACP. And then the final piece of mythology that is never fully resolved in the Rosa Parks case is that it's through her work that Martin Luther King Jr. became nationally recognized. It's from this particular moment in the boycott that happens after she gets arrested. The boycott happens for it's over a year after Rosa Parks gets arrested. During that time is when the Montgomery NAACP begins recruiting a very young preacher. I think he was 23 at the time, Martin Luther King Jr. This is how he rises to prominence. So Rosa Parks is part of the origin story of the greatest civil rights leader that you've probably heard about throughout your entire life. Anytime anyone mentions Black history, Martin Luther King Jr. comes up. So here we have this connection to a very specific moment in time in a very specific place in history in Montgomery, Alabama. That's, thousands of miles away from where we are if you're in Arizona with me. The other thing that I think is really crucial to understanding the Rosa Parks mythology is the year. So she's arrested on December 5th, 1955. Claudette Colvin had been arrested 9 months prior. Why this moment is crucial, not just the kind of connection of Claudette Colvin being almost a year before Rosa Parks, it's actually that year 1955 that's so crucial to think about. Brown v. Board of Education was the United States Supreme Court mandate, meaning when it's the Supreme Court, they say federally across the entire country, states don't have a claim on this. The Supreme Court says across the country, separate but equal segregation is no longer valid. So Homer Plessy in 1898, they say separate but equal is okay. Brown v. Board of Education, 56 years later, actually says, no, we're going to change that. No segregation is allowed. And yet a year later, 54 is Brown v. Board, 55 is Claudette Colvin and Rosa Parks. They weren't just sitting on a bus and saying they weren't going to move because they didn't feel like it, because they wanted to fight segregation because they thought it was wrong. They were sitting on that bus and demanding their constitutional rights, the protections they had under the law federally across the country. It doesn't matter what your city ordinance is. It doesn't matter what your state law is. If the federal government, if the Supreme Court says that segregation is illegal, it's illegal, period. So Claudette Colvin, Rosa Parks, and the other women involved in this is a female-led operation here. All the women involved in this aren't just saying segregation is wrong. They're saying it's my constitutional right to sit here on this bus. Bring it on. That's what they were saying. She wasn't tired. She was informed. She knew what her rights were. She knew that this was illegal federally and that she would win. And then finally, Rosa Parks gets the name, right? She's the person who gets all the credit for kind of launching the civil rights movement in many ways. Claudette Colvin is one of 3 plaintiffs that actually see their case, their lawsuit, go all the way to the Supreme Court. Rosa Parks' name is not on that court case. This 15-year-old girl and her 3 other colleagues at the time, they file suit all the way up to the Supreme Court. Do you ever wonder why Claudette Colvin's story isn't told as frequently as Rosa Parks? Do you ever kind of think to yourself, well, wait, why in the world would we know the Rosa Parks story, but not the Claudette Colvin story? And that is the foundation of the argument about the long civil rights movement. So this is why we're talking about kind of the theoretical framework around understanding civil rights. I'll tell you by the end why Claudette Colvin's story wasn't the one that is told the way Rosa Parks is. Earlier in the assignment, you probably saw a link to an article called The Long Civil Rights Movement and the Political Uses of the Past. This is written by Jacqueline Dowd Hall. It's a lengthy article and it's relatively advanced and sophisticated in language, but I encourage you to either read it or scan it or at least kind of read through it, see if you can understand what Hall is arguing. One of her primary concerns is the political use of what she calls a meta-narrative and the way the narrative is framed politically and packaged and given to people. That's why she's really contending with that tension between why is Rosa Parks the story and not Claudette Colvin. She says remembrance is always a form of forgetting. And the dominant narrative of the civil rights movement, distilled from history and memory, twisted by ideology and political contestation, and embedded in heritage tours, museums, public rituals, textbooks, and various artifacts of mass culture, distorts and suppresses as much as it reveals. So she's saying that a mythology of the history, the narrative of what happened, leaves out just as much as it highlights. And it's crucial to understanding this kind of reframing or rewriting of a story, because you've been in those history classes. I'm sure I've led those history classes where all it is just sort of a regurgitation of like this happened and then this happened and this happened. And that gets boring for students. That gets boring for general audiences. So instead, historians and writers and journalists and museums, the like, we're all challenged to tell you a story about a history that brings you in and enraptures you into the details. And in doing so, you have to edit. You have to make choices, what to leave out and what to leave in. So here's what Hall's discussing when she's talking about what's called a classical narrative. Now, a narrative is another word for story. And what she's saying is that what English professors say is that every story has kind of a classic arc. At the bottom, you have exposition. And I'll kind of give you an example of that in a moment in terms of the civil rights movement. So be patient if you're like, okay, we get it. Or maybe if you're like, I still don't understand. We're going to keep going on this. Exposition is the setting of the story. So the who, the what, the when, and anything you might need to know about what happened before. So think about if you missed a TV show, you skipped an episode, you fell asleep watching Netflix, and you put it on the next day and you realize that you slept through one of the episodes. Exposition in that new episode you're watching is the moment when one of the characters kind of explains for the audience what happened in a previous episode. So it's kind of a good example. Or if you're watching like a sequel to a movie, the way you can pick up a sequel if you haven't seen the original is somewhere in the story, one of the characters or more will explain. They'll expose what happened previously to get us here. So exposition is kind of the framing, the beginning of the story and what happened before, as well as where we are and kind of what the realities are in this moment. And then you have kind of rising action. So you have a building of tension, a building of conflict, a building of concerns, or action can also be like when a superhero is training, right? Or they're meeting their mentor or their fairy godmother. Those kinds of things are like almost packing a snowball. You're getting it more and more consolidated, and you're building to this moment, which is the climax. This is the moment in the story where everything comes to a head and something is going to change. Everything's going to be this way, and then over the top of the climax, things are going to be a totally new way. Historians are obsessed with what they consider a watershed moment. This is a climax in a historical narrative in which things are happening, then something really big happens. World War II is a good example. And then as a result of World War II, everything's different on the other side. That's a watershed, much like a waterfall, right? So that's what a climax in the classical narrative is. So you might think of this one as the moment when Rosa Parks does not get up from her seat and her three friends do. And then you have kind of falling action, sort of like the end of the story, how the story kind of comes to a soft landing. And then at the end, there's a resolution. Storytellers call this a point. This is when the story gets explained to the audiences as how it's important. Think about that video we just saw about Rosa Parks. The resolution might be the Supreme Court decision that segregation on public buses is not legal. That's a good example of resolution. Another great example of resolution in the story of Rosa Parks is the rise to prominence of Martin Luther King Jr. So let me give you some more kind of concrete examples. If we're telling the civil rights movement, according to Hall, of course, in the classical narrative, she says the setting is Jim Crow South post-World War II. So it's post-World War II, and we're in the South primarily, and that is where this all takes place. Okay, then the exposition is backstory. What happened before? It begins in kind of 1954 with Brown v. Board of Education. The Supreme Court rules that segregation in schools and public accommodation is no longer constitutional. It's illegal, it's outlawed, it's not okay. And then she says the classical narrative frames the civil rights movement as a series of escalating public protests. Think about the March on Washington. That's the I Have a Dream speech, for example. Selma, when there's the march across the bridge and African-American protesters are attacked. Or the Freedom Rides, where white and Black riders intentionally desegregate buses moving into the American South, and it gets increasingly violent and dangerous for them. Or Freedom Summer, where an African-American and white American students go into the South and try to register as many voters as possible. And they also face violence and resistance. That's kind of that rising action. Things are building, we're packing that snowball, right? And then in the classical narrative, moral clarity is the climax. Everyone decides that segregation is wrong. Everyone contends that segregation, violence, and sort of Jim Crow racism is bad, and the whole country needs to reframe the way it's thinking. So think about the way you learned about this in school when you heard the story of Rosa Parks. Like, she sits on the bus, but then like, what happens? This poor little old lady sitting on a bus, and why is that important? Why do they sell this to sixth graders as if this is like saying something? They have to explain it. And so the climax is this moral clarity that the entire country faces. So there's this moment, everything changes as a result of Rosa Parks, I Have a Dream, whatever. And for us, at least in terms of historians, the way we discuss these things, is it's typically symbolized by some sort of federal legislation. So the Supreme Court rules this or that. In 1964 and 1965, respectively, President Johnson signs a series of bills or laws like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And then you start to see kind of the way, I mean, imagine if you were in a traditional history class, you'd kind of taper off from the civil rights story and you'd move into something else about the 1960s or the 1970s. For example, the Vietnam War starts to distract people from the civil rights movement. You have the death of several civil rights leaders, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. included. You have kind of an urban decline. You have a rise of crime in American cities. You also have the rise, which we'll talk about in our next lesson, of Black militancy groups, the Black Panthers and the like, who begin to contest the civil rights framework of nonviolent, peaceful protest, and they start to show a different strategy. Or you see things like major programs nationwide, like affirmative action and welfare. So think about that civil rights narrative that you may have learned before. You've got this bad stuff going on, racism and segregation. You've got rising action in terms of protests and movements and things like Rosa Parks. Then you have this turning point or the climax where everything starts to shift. And then you have a falling narrative of things becoming less important because other things are becoming more important. And then the resolution is, now we have Black History Month. Now there's no segregation. Now racism is dead. Now, of course, in the early 21st century, we know that those things aren't necessarily widely accepted, but the classical narrative paints it that way, or at least attempts to do so. So here's the thing. What's wrong with this? Why would this be a problem? In your opinion, why would the classical narrative, and in Jacqueline Hall's opinion, why would this be a problem, right? Well, she says that it leaves out a longer, broader Black freedom struggle. There's so much more to the story. And at this point in our class, you already know there's a ton happening before the 1950s around the Black freedom struggle. It just wasn't maybe called civil rights quite yet. So she's saying these stories, this classical narrative, distorts and erases just as much as it reveals. And therefore, to fully understand the civil rights and Black freedom struggles histories, you have to take a look at a longer story, meaning it starts earlier and it maybe doesn't end, right? It starts earlier and continues into a much longer period. It's not distilled between 1954 or World War II and 1965. She's saying, no. It started a long time ago. It kept going. You also need to look at it in a broader length. Like it's not just a timeline, it's also a geography. And let me tell you what I mean by that. So she's saying you have to include more voices. You have to look geographically where we're at, and you need to really think about the when. So the longer, broader civil rights movement. The longer one, like I said, involves all kinds of things we've already talked about in this class. Truly, Dowd Hall and others believe that civil rights or the Black freedom struggle really began with the arrival of Africans to North America. So there's always been a move for freedom. It's not like African Americans woke up in the 1950s and were like, you know what, this is wrong. Like they've always known, they've always been agitating for change. And it's all part of this longer framework of civil rights. It's also a broader narrative. On the left, you can see a classical narrative. This is a map of major civil rights activities, primarily in the American South. Well, what Dowd Hall is saying is, no, there was civil rights stuff happening all across America, all in California, in Arizona, in parts of the urban North, throughout the Midwest. If we don't look beyond the Jim Crow South, we make the assumption that everything was great in America, except in the 1950s in the South. But this is not true, because we had civil rights protests happening in Phoenix in 1965, in 1963. We had things happening all across the country, because all across the country, Black people lived there and they deserved rights just as much as anyone else. And all across the country, Phoenix included, as you will find, had laws that distinguished what white people and Black people could do. More importantly, how Black people could not interact with white people in certain ways. Arizona was a segregated state when it came to public education. It's written in the state constitution that African-American kids could not go to school with white kids. And that if the district wanted to change that, they had to vote. Each district had to vote if they wanted to change segregation. So everywhere in the country, not just in the Jim Crow South, where it seemed to be the worst, everywhere these kinds of activities were happening because everywhere Black people were agitating for freedom. Here's the other thing. Jacqueline Dowd Hall is also saying, on the one side, the classical narrative, the who is really focused on like these big four. So there's a couple different people that could be seen as the major civil rights leaders of the 20th century, but primarily on the left, you see W.B. Du Bois, who was a Black intellectual. You learned a little bit about him during our session on the New Negro movement. You have Malcolm X, who is more of a militant, self-reliance type activist in the 1950s and 60s. Martin Luther King Jr., who needs no introduction but deserves one nonetheless, and Rosa Parks. Think about every other Black History Month event you've ever attended. Likely, unless it's a focus or emphasis on local history, it's gonna be about one of these four people. But Hall is saying, whoa, this is a varied movement with varied voices. It's longer, meaning it's much older. It goes much earlier than 1950s, and it's broader. It involves people from all across the country. For example, she identifies there were 40,000 African-American bus riders who protested the Montgomery bus system in 1955 as a result of Claudette Colvin, Rosa Parks, and others who refused to allow segregation on these buses. 40,000 people participated in the Montgomery bus boycott movement. No one would know about Rosa Parks if it was not for those 40,000 people. Otherwise, it would just be like a random lady sitting on a bus fighting with the bus driver. This is a story that made national news for over a year. 40,000 people contributed to that. Are they not also activists? Are they not also contributing to the civil rights movement? There were 13 original freedom riders. They were typically Black and white college students or young adults who, like I said, took buses, Greyhound buses, into the American South, attempting to desegregate buses and bus stations. There were 13 originals. When they all were attacked, some of them arrested, many of them sent home, many of them were like brutalized. 10 more students finished the job. That's 23 students like you, who either were in high school or college that attended and participated in the freedom rides, not freedom rights, freedom rides in the 1950s and 60s. You know that I Have a Dream speech, that very famous speech that you hear all the time during February? 250,000 people attended the March on Washington and were there during that speech. If they had not been there, Martin Luther King Jr. would have just been speaking to the, to the reflection pool. Like he would have just been speaking to like a vacant, open, open park. There are 250,000 people who made that speech so important, and other people who listened to it, heard it, or read it after the fact. 600 marchers from Selma to Montgomery on Bloody Sunday who were attacked. And at its height, the Black Panther Party had 2,000 members. The Black Panther Party, it's contested, but it mostly started either in California or New York City. And truly not a Jim Crow South place. This is an urban organization that started in the 1960s. And at its height, there were at least 2,000 leaders as a part of this organization. So this is what Jacqueline Dowd Hall is saying. She's saying the classical narrative, you have to clean it up to make it interesting and relevant and packaged for audiences. But you're a college student. You all are in this class because you're honor students or you're advanced and you want to know more than just the classical narrative. So I'm going to give you some other examples of classic or varied voices. You've learned already about Ida B. Wells. You've learned about Booker T. Washington. What about the Harlem Renaissance? Can't that be considered part of the Black freedom struggle? What about the million people who moved out of the South and took the Black freedom struggle to places like Oklahoma, Texas, Arizona, California, Michigan, New York City, Chicago? Those folks are participating in the Black freedom struggle just as much as anyone else. Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, African-American women who helped register people to vote, or Ella Baker, who helped the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee get its start. How about Huey P. Newton, Bobby Seale, Eldridge Cleaver, and Angela Davis, founders of the Black Panther Party? Diane Nash, who was one of the 10 freedom riders who took up the charge after the original 13 had to stop. They were forced to stop. Stokely Carmichael, who you'll learn about in another lesson, who founded, he really transformed SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and influenced CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. Stokely Carmichael is the guy who coined the term Black Power, not Malcolm X, and not the Black Panther Party, right? Stokely Carmichael. Who is he? Why don't you know about him? Some of you do, I'm sure, but some of you are like, I've never seen that name before in my life. The Prophet Elijah Muhammad, I got something to tell you. He was the leader of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X's organization. When Malcolm X became nationally known, he was under the Nation of Islam. Elijah Muhammad, so one of the best, most known of these varied voices, who I believe his headquarters was in Chicago. He had a winter home about 2 miles north of South Mountain Community College, maybe not even a mile and a half. That's right. One of the most significant leaders of the civil rights movement had a home in South Phoenix, and it's still there today, and you can go visit. Maybe you know about it, maybe you don't. So I'm intentionally getting us closer and closer to our local story. Travis L. Williams, he was a veteran of World War II. When veterans came back from World War II, they were given money by the federal government to buy homes or go to school. Travis Williams, who was an African-American whose parents lived here in the Phoenix area, tried to buy a house and he couldn't because he was Black. So you know what Travis Williams did? He started his own construction company and he built an entire residential neighborhood here in South Phoenix for Black families. These were some of the best houses in the city at the time in the 1950s and 60s. Now the community is transformed significantly now. It's not as heavily African-American and some of the homes have fallen into disrepair. But if you were to drive around South Phoenix in this area, you would see Travis Williams's mark. And he did that here in Phoenix, Arizona. So he's a varied voice. He's a part of the civil rights story. You just probably didn't hear about him. Similarly, Goldie Hart was a local principal in the Roosevelt School District. So she worked in South Phoenix. And she and her husband started the first African-American insurance company in town because guess what? You couldn't buy insurance if you were African-American in the 1960s. So Goldie and her husband started the Sun Valley Insurance Company and sold insurance to Black buyers. Also revolutionary, also civil rights, no? And then finally, Dr. Josephine Pete, who grew up here in South Phoenix, just south of the Salt River, attended schools in the Roosevelt School District and South Mountain High School, stayed local, became an educator herself, a teacher, and then a principal, ultimately became the first African-American and the first woman to lead South Mountain High School as its principal. South Mountain High School right here on 7th near Southern. Now, okay, she's just a lady. She's just a professional. She just grew up here, right? But here's how she's an example of the longer, broader freedom struggle and why she's a varied voice of the longer, broader freedom struggle. Dr. Pete, when she became principal of South Mountain High School in the 1980s, did you know that South Mountain High School's mascot was the Rebel? Their school was referred to as the Southerner, and their mascot, the Rebel, was a Confederate soldier. Now, if you know anything about African-American history, you know that the Confederate soldier is an icon of racism and slavery. So under Josephine Pete's guard, she helped mobilize African-American, Latino, and white students in South Phoenix to force the district to change the mascot of South Mountain High School, the primary high school for African-Americans in the entire city. Most people, the largest concentration of African-Americans were at South Mountain High School. They lobbied the district to get the name changed from the Confederate to the Jaguar. Okay, isn't she an example of a civil rights leader? Isn't she an example of a varied voice? She's not in the South. It's not 1950. It's not 1965. We're talking 1980s at this point. So this is my point to you, is that the classical narrative, right? The classical narrative leaves out all of these stories. But the classical narrative also makes it cleaner and easier to digest and easier to understand and easier to remember. But as historians, you're not just students. You're not just participants in like an entertainment process. You're not just hearing and listening. You're also critiquing and trying to analyze on your own. So this is a crucial read. I know this article, it's long, it's heavily theoretical. I've given you some of the highlights. But if you can, read Jacqueline Dowd Hall's The Long Civil Rights Movement and the Political Uses of the Past. Now, she published this in 2005, and at the time it was completely revolutionary. But since then, historians like me and others across the world have tried to implement her theories in teaching and telling, researching and writing about the civil rights movement. That's it for me today, everybody. I hope you enjoyed today's lecture, and I look forward to seeing what you have to say about Claudette Colvin and the rest of the civil rights narrative.